most of us will be turning our videos off uh, during the conference, during the conversation, and we'll be using the chat for everyone to speak. Um, but we're going to be using a kind of fishbowl format where those who are in conversation with Bev and Etienne turn their videos on. So welcome everyone. This is John Smith representing CP Square. This is an event that uh, is on a kind of new direction for Bev and Etienne. They've been developing it, of course, for several years, but this is our first session in CP Square about this, this direction. So as you all know, there are three sessions. Today is kind of an overview and somewhat more theoretical approach, although as we talked about this event, we wanted to make sure to mix practice and theory throughout. So we'll be going back and forth between a more overview perspective and what we can learn from individual cases as we go. So today we start with more emphasis on theory. Tomorrow, Mark Kunders will talk about Happy Forum, and on Thursday, we'll hear more about the experience of the IDEA partnership. So I'm going to close my mic off and my video, and I'll be sitting here listening and helping taking notes. I just want to encourage everybody, if you can, to join us in the conversation online afterwards, where we can take some of these questions and go more deeply with them. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Bev and Etienne. And we can't hear you, Bev, yet. So as luck always has it, it was um, working at our test about a half hour ago, and now we're having some difficulties. Um, so at the moment, we can't hear Bev and Etienne, although we see them. They are alive. Their lips are moving. No beads on their foreheads yet. They're well accustomed to such challenges. And we happen to have seen them upload the slides several times, so they're in troubleshooting mode. And I'm pretending to be the color man that looks at a basketball game and reminds everyone that we're live still. So in the interim, I think everybody who's here could use the poll at the top to identify themselves in terms of where, what kind of organization they're involved in. I just voted, and I see that a number of other people have voted. Looks like most people are from education, and we have a few from business, very few from healthcare, and weighing in with a strong showing from other.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
we can. Wonderful.
Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know if you said this, but it's nice to see, who's here. Most people seem to be from education. If you haven't completed that little poll in the top right, please do that. And mostly education, business, healthcare, and other. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay, so this session is just to discuss, and we hope that it's going to be much more of a discussion than a presentation, because for us it is really work in progress. These are ideas that we are still developing, but we wanted to talk about a kind of figure ground shift that has happened in our own work. You know, the concept of community of practice has always been an important concept in our learning theory, but and we've always completely recognized that any community is developing in the context of other practices, in the context of other structures that are important for the practice of that community. But of late, we have focused more on the structure of the landscape as opposed to the development of a single community.
Yes, because actually more and more the work that we have with clients, a lot of my work, for example, is in international development, more and more it's just not, it's too complicated, it's too complex to be able to talk about a single community of practice. There are actually in any one situation overlapping communities of practice, and so thinking of it as one is not as helpful as thinking of it as a whole bunch of communities of practice, a whole bunch of networks, and looking at them all together and seeing how they overlap and how they all fit into a greater, what we call, landscape.
And within that landscape, then you could have interventions that have somewhat the shape of the community of practice, that is still focused very much on practice, but these are communities that are much more complex because they are not defined by people having a similar job or a similar function or a similar competence, but they are characterized by a lot of negotiation across different practices in order to make progress together.
So actually, here's an example. This is a community of practice. We were actually called here to work with a community of practice. This is actually at least 3 communities of practice. It's 3 different people from different parts of the same landscape so one group is from funding organizations. So we had funding organizations here for like the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, a whole range of different funding organizations, and civil society organizations, local civil society organizations, regional ones, global ones, and researchers, all 3 of whom want to get better at transparency and accountability and at learning how to do transparency and accountability better.
And so these people are used to interacting with each other, but very much on a transactional mode. So funders who sends out a request for proposals, the civil society organization gets a grant, there is some agreement about what the grant should achieve, and then they call in an evaluator or an academic to evaluate whether the grant is accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish.
And so what they wanted to do was to change the nature of the conversation so that rather than, well, in fact, in this particular landscape, the civil society organizations would say, well, how can we really do any proper learning? Yes, with your project requirements, we have to write up a page of lessons learned. And we do that more like sort of compliance, or we sit down and we brainstorm and we say lessons learned. And really they wanted to take the conversations to another level, which is how do we really learn not just our own lessons learned, but how as a field do we learn to do transparency and accountability better?
And so it was still a community of practice in the sense that they were very much focused on the practice of developing relationships, of creating projects, of understanding what these projects were achieving, why they were achieving it, why they were not achieving it. It was still very much focused on practice, but with a lot of boundary negotiation that needed to happen between those different practices. So we are always taking a little pause to allow people to come in with a story or question.
Especially if it's something that you relate to. Okay. And in some ways, actually, it seems like pretty obvious. Well, you know, if you want to get better, then let's bring these people to talk together. But actually, each different group within this community have a whole history of a whole language that they have for themselves, a whole set of concerns that they have. They have years and years of mistrust or of a certain type of relationship. And so how we bring people together and how we get them to communicate across boundaries, across those traditional boundaries, and how we, what we say, reconfigure those boundaries becomes a new sort of art rather than simply just getting people together to talk about their shared practice.
So Diana asked us to say something about landscape versus ecosystem, and you know, those are two metaphors that would work and do different things. You know, you could talk about an ecosystem of practice. One of the reasons the notion of landscape has worked well for us is that it has this notion of a texture where there are hills. So think of a community of practice as a group that has colonized a certain area of the landscape and created a hill. And that hill somehow defines what learning is going to be in that region of the landscape. So a community of practice then becomes a social process by which a gradient is created between not being very good and being very, very good. So a community becomes a little colony with a hill, and it's the community that decides who gets up the hill and what it means to get up the hill.
And some hills may be very steep hills, so it takes a lot of work to actually go up. Some hills might be sort of rolling hills, you know, gradual ones where you can stroll up to the top. You don't need to mountain climb. Some may have a sort of slope at the beginning and then a steep summit. So yeah, thinking of hills is a neat way to think of a community of practice, perhaps.
Now, I will give the example of a cousin of mine who told me he's a particle physicist. He told me there are 10 people in the world who understand what I'm doing. That's a very, very, you know, it's almost like a needle, you know. And to stay at the top, you have to be really, really good and recognized by those other 9 people as contributing to that hill. It may be difficult then for people on that hill to communicate what they are doing with other people because the path is so steep and the valley is so low right next to that hill.
So Jenny asks if it's important to understand why the hills were formed as they were. I would say in my experience that that having some idea of why how and why the hills were formed is important, but not so important that it becomes a stumbling block. Because sometimes people say, well, we can never, we can never build a bridge between these two hills because of this history. So actually sometimes knowing the history can then be a barrier to actually using your imagination and reconfiguring it in another way. So probably both, I would say, Jenny.
And to build on a question by Jenny, yes, it does distance you from the rest of the landscape. I think that's the problem of deep expertise, is that, yes, it does make it sometimes more difficult for you to really convey. And actually, some people are very good at crossing those boundaries and explaining to others. I remember I was visiting a department in UC Santa Cruz, University of California at Santa Cruz. It was the environmental department. And there, to get a PhD, one of the requirements was that you had to go spend a few months in a local high school helping the teachers develop classes on environmental issues. And for me, I was like, wow, this is really good. So these people have understood that actually becoming very, very, very good at environmental issues does distance you from the landscape. To make sure that these PhD students don't float off into a very steep competence, they wanted to make sure that as part of your PhD, you're going to spend a few months with high school students trying to make them understand in their terms what distances you from the landscape in some sense. So I thought it was a very interesting move on the part of the designers of that program to think that to be a good environmentalist, you have to be both very specialized, very good at the science of environment, but also very good at telling non-members what your science is about so that you can have some effect on the world. So I think they were struggling with the tension between being very good at something and not letting this be very good at something kind of like distance you so much from the landscape that you don't have an ability to affect the broader landscape. Well, I think that you are really putting your finger on a very real tension in the notion of a landscape.
That's right. And so Lucy and Brenda's questions are leading actually to thinking of the landscape. And yet, because the idea of competence in a community of practice led to all these kind of questions that you're asking, that's where the idea of a landscape and actually now being able to navigate your way across a landscape, sort of modulating your identity in relation to the different hills in that landscape, being sufficiently knowledgeable about certain hills that you're able to have conversations with people on that hill, but not necessarily aiming to be somebody at the top, but having some kind of legitimacy on those different hills. That's where we start talking about knowledgeability. Knowledgeability is different to competence. Knowledgeability is more that you can navigate your way through the landscape.
So this is actually interesting from the point of view of developing theory, is that here that orientation towards the landscape as a figure as opposed to a ground as it was before has forced us to introduce some new concepts into the theory. And knowledgeability is a very important one that we have introduced. In tension with competence, as Jenny was saying, there is a tension between being competent and being knowledgeable. And so we would define competence as knowing as related to to the hill of the community, and then knowledgeability as knowing as oriented towards the whole landscape. And so, knowledgeability may include a lot of practices in which you yourself have no competence, which makes learning a bit more difficult to define, because when it's a very well-defined hill, what it means to become better is well-defined because there's a whole community to say, no, this person is getting better, or no, this person is no good, they need to be kicked out of that hill. When it's with respect to the landscape, it is, we lose a little bit of precision about our social definition of learning, but we gain an ability to see a person oriented towards the whole landscape and not just towards some specific hill.
And Brenda's asked an important question, which is running to the top of the chat. But she says the systems convener is not likely to be at the top of the hill. Now, the person that we're talking about as a systems convener tends to be somebody who looks at landscapes rather than hills. And they're somebody who looks at a landscape like the one we see here and says, whoa, actually there's something missing here. We need to make an intervention in this landscape, and we need to be connecting or bringing together, maybe building bridges or building tunnels, or maybe even starting a new hill in this landscape. And so, yes, the systems convener is not likely to be at the top of the hill, although a systems convener needs some kind of legitimacy in that landscape in order to be able to do any messing around with that landscape. So in fact, a systems convener may once have been at the top of a hill and got themselves a good reputation in it, and then gains a certain amount of legitimacy to be able to come in and start building tunnels and bridges that other people will believe in. Okay? But actually, the kind of systems conveners that we're seeing, they've often been people who have actually traveled up and down a number of hills and have got legitimacy in different places across the landscape, which makes it easier for them when they want to build a bridge or build a tunnel or start something new, to be able to talk with the different people in the different hills. They've somehow learned enough of the language of the people in the different hills to be able to bring them in to some aspiration that they have for reconfiguring that landscape.
Before it scrolls up, I wanted to pick up on Molly's point, which is very good, yes. So every metaphor breaks down at some point. The problem of the landscape metaphor is precisely the problem that you bring out, Lottie, is that it makes it sound as you can only be in one place at one time. It has the advantage that you can talk about a trajectory. You can talk about learning as a travel through the landscape, but it is also true that we belong to many hills at any given time. And so there, the landscape metaphor is a problem, and we don't have a very good way to visualize the multi-membership of people as they travel. So this is a weakness of the metaphor. If you have a solution for us, Lottie, we'd be very grateful. But at this point, we just have to admit that it is a place where the metaphor doesn't do the work that we would like it to do.
And that's an interesting question from Gabrielle, with what about a map in this landscape? Thinking from the systems convener's perspective, actually it's hard. It's often with systems conveners often don't have a very clear map, or they may have a map in their head, a sort of general idea, but they don't have a map that they can very clearly show to people, this is where we are and this is where we want to go. It's more like they are designing the map, because the cartography doesn't exist yet, and so they're sort of designing it. So they've got to have enough of a vision that they're able to say to people, look, this is what the map could look like, this is what the landscape could look like, and this is how we could get there, but, what do you think? And try to bring people into creating that map.
And actually, that's a piece of work that we do with our clients. Actually, to develop the cartography, Diana was saying, is system thinking, a kind of cartography of the landscape. That is very true. And we try to, especially when we work with convening teams, we try to put them in front of a huge piece of paper and start laying down the different stakeholders, the different practices, the boundaries that are problematic, the boundaries that are promising. So yes, the idea of mapping is really important in that context, so that you can then very strategically see where there are interventions that would open a new space, creating a new bridge, and so on and so forth. I just wanted also to pick up on John's point. So competence is knowing how to scale hills. Yeah, I would say knowledge ability could lead you to build bridge between hills, but in and of itself is not building bridges. I mean, a good use of knowledge ability would be to help build bridges between hills, but knowledge ability in and of itself is more an orientation towards the landscape that allows you to see where your hill is, to see how it relates to other hills, to understand why people on one hill have a hard time understanding when you talk, because their perspective is very different. So it's a broader concept than simply building bridges, although it is an important condition for building bridges.
And also John's comment about conveners may have competence, must have knowledgeability. Certainly conveners have to be, yes, they have to have knowledgeability. That's a key component of conveners. And they probably, in order to have legitimacy, they must also have some kind of competence. But you're right, it sort of may have competence, but competence as a way of giving them legitimacy in the landscape. So if I think of the transparency and accountability group that we were working with, the convener in that case, it was actually there is a cooperative of funding organizations who had convened this community of practice. And they had legitimacy in the fact that they were funders. But was there anybody there who had been a civil society organization evaluated? Yeah.
Well, actually, Brandon has.
Yes. Yes, exactly. When they put out their call for the facilitator, in fact, Flo too.
Yeah.
Flo, the person who played the role of the systems convener, who was employed by the funding cooperative, she actually straddled all three. She was able to talk to researchers. She had a long history of political activism in South America. She was from Argentina. And yes, and now she was working for a funding organization. But she didn't see herself as any of those three things. She didn't see herself as a funder or as a civil society organization or as an evaluator or a researcher. But she was totally comfortable talking to all three.
Actually, I wanted to quickly respond to Nancy Dixon, who was asking, what about transparency and accountability in your work with communities and landscape? Actually, in this case, the transparency and accountability is a domain of the community. So it is not the process of the community itself, although it could be, and there are questions about how transparent the community should be with respect to how it develops itself. But in this case, it is the domain that all these people recognize themselves as contributing to, which is a part of international development. So basically, it is the process of making the budget of different countries transparent, and then the process of holding the governments of these countries accountable to the budgeting process. I just wanted to just clarify that. So we don't have in the theory, we don't have this concept yet embedded into the theory itself.
I like David's question of the landscape, are you seeing the past, the present, the future, or all? I guess that would depend who you are and where you're sitting, actually. The hills represent, they represent the past. It takes a long time for a hill, to become a hill. It takes centuries. People who are in the landscape are probably thinking very much of it in the present. And the systems convener is very much seeing the potential. And often the systems convener is one of the only people who can see the potential. So they're looking at the future. Oh my God, if we just did this and this, then this is what the landscape could look like. So the landscape, yes, is the past, the present, and the future, represented in different ways and by different people.
And building on that, to talk about Darren's point, you're right that landscapes of practice are often more dynamic than physical landscapes, although two things. First of all, if you try to reconfigure a landscape, you realize that there is a lot of inertia, that those hills are not that easy to move, and building a new hill is really a challenge, There's a lot of earth to move. If you decide that there needs to be a new hill somewhere and you want to compete with a hill that already exists. So it is true that, if you look at some urban landscapes, they move so fast, they move faster than any practice can. And so one of the reasons we like the landscape metaphor is that it also connotes that there is resistance, that there is, as Bev was saying, there is history, and that history creates, fairly well-established hills that are not that easy to move around. It takes very big pieces of equipment, like those big caterpillar things,
And a question that just, I've lost it now, but it was the convener is creating the landscape. Actually, no. What the convener is doing is looking at an existing landscape and saying, whoa, we could reconfigure this landscape in another way that would make different types of people from different hills talk to each other in new ways to create something new. And that leads in a way, I suppose, to Jackie's question, where she says a systems convener needs to have leadership skills, but must be able to listen to members to move COP forward. In this case, I'm not sure. Leadership skills is so broad, so we might need to be a bit more specific. But what conveners are very good at doing is, or what they have to do, is they have to be able to look at the existing boundaries in a landscape and respect those boundaries. Because if you go in and if somebody keeps jumping around with the slides, can you leave them alone? A convener goes in and they both have to know where the boundaries are, respect them, because there's a whole history behind boundaries, what's inside, what's outside, and why a boundary is there. There's a whole history behind it. So a convener needs to know them enough to be able to respect them, but at the same time to be able to challenge them, and challenge them in ways that people will be happy to or forced to shift them. So there's a part of the leadership skill of a convener is this business of being able to respect and challenge boundaries.
Actually, we would even say that systems convening is itself a type of leadership that may inherit some of the traditional leadership skill, but may also include other ways of being in the world. And this legitimacy, I think, is really important, because often leaders in the traditional notion of leadership, they have a place, like they are the CEO of a company or the president of a country or something like that, and they have leadership skills. Often the convener is like, who are you? do you know anything? Do you know what it's like to be an astronomer? And so Diana was asking what's the difference between legitimacy and reputation. We would say that reputation may be a part of legitimacy. So if you have a reputation in a landscape, that will actually give you some legitimacy, or if you have a bad reputation, remove some legitimacy. But it's also like the way you interact with people that gives you legitimacy, the way that you represent certain organizations. In the case, for instance, in the case of the transparency and accountability community, part of the legitimacy is just that it's a funders cooperative who decided to fund it, and the fact that the funders themselves are behind it. The funders themselves are saying, we need to learn how to learn together. We need to learn how to explore mistakes and failures together so that we can learn from those failures. The fact that it's coming from a powerful group like the funders gives some legitimacy. So legitimacy is a very complex view of what enables a person to convince others to join in a reconfiguration of the landscape.
These questions are going up so quick.
Yeah, well, I think in different directions.
So it's sort of following, trying to follow a thread is about systems conveners appearing or evolve. In fact, what happened was with this paper on systems conveners, that came about because one thing that we noticed is that there are certain people nowadays that we work with, often our clients, who just have what we call a systems convening bug. They can't help themselves. They tend to see things as landscapes. They tend to think strategically, and they tend to think broadly. And they are really passionate about what it is that they're doing. Really passionate. They're the kind of people who stay up day and night thinking about it. They'll leverage their personal connections to try and make things happen across the landscape. And so it was partly trying to identify what are the characteristics of these people who often, against all odds, they're often mavericks in their own organization. They're often have to fall over 100 times, but they still keep pushing on. They have this vision in their head and this determination to push on. And they do seem to be able to move mountains. So that's how that paper started, was talking to different people and trying to categorize what is it that a systems convener looks like. Can we categorize that? And if so, can we create some discipline of systems convening to help people to become better at systems convening? And actually, we're talking about landscapes here. Often our clients are people who are working with very big landscapes, crossing countries or crossing disciplines or sectors. But actually, you'll see, we notice as well that people at all levels of scale in the landscape, right? There are some people who do it even in, if you look around you now, it could be it could be, I don't know, someone in your neighborhood, but someone who can't help themselves but be thinking about, the other neighborhoods around, the people in the road next door. But there seems to be some people who have this bug, and they seem to be more important now as things become more complex and as our systems are sort of overlapping and becoming global.
And building on John's point and what Bev was saying, there are very different purposes in the landscape, very different perspective, very different motivation for learning. And actually, tomorrow and day after tomorrow, when we look in more depth into one project, you see two different projects of systems convening, of reshaping and reconfiguring a landscape, you will see actually what a dance those systems conveners have to dance between the different purposes and the different perspectives, both respecting each of those hills, if you will, as having coherence and having legitimacy, but also asking those hills to reorient themselves so that they can still do what they're doing, but they do it more oriented towards how they affect the landscape. So it is, and you will see tomorrow and day after tomorrow when these practitioners tell you the kind of work that they do and the way that they find ways to reconcile multiple perspectives into a way of moving a practice forward or moving a set of practice forward. It's really incredible artistic work, to do that well.
And Gabrielle's question of if conveners and visionaries share traits, yes, in part they do. Often a systems convener is somebody who is a little bit of a visionary, but they can't just be visionaries. There are people who have to be able to sort of spark the imagination of people in the landscape to be able to think of themselves outside their current position in that landscape. At the same time, they need to be able to engage those people in very concrete ways that will help them to see that they can make progress in this new configured landscape, so that people are prepared to take risks across those boundaries and in these new types of conversation. But that takes quite careful design around how to actually engage people in those new types of conversations. And so as well as being visionary or being able to trigger people's imagination, and as well as being able to engage people, a system convener also needs to be able to align what it is, what people are going to do in this landscape, and make sure that it aligns with what they're already doing, so that they don't see this as a new thing. It's not like, come and join my new religion, drop everything and come with me. People need to be able to align what they're already doing in their organization with this new vision of the landscape. So it's more complex than just being a visionary and coming up with a good new idea.
Just to take I think Nancy wanted to talk about the role of metaphors in social theory. Lots of social theory has to do with the use of language, and therefore some metaphorical. As far as the term landscape is a good way to convey the view of multiple communities interacting and colonizing the territory of knowledge, if you will. We could have chosen other terms. We could have chosen system. We could just, somebody was proposing ecosystem. The language is useful for getting people to think in a certain way. I wouldn't say that the language is the theory. The language is a way to engage people with the theory. And somebody was asking, I think David was asking earlier, is this a language that you find useful for conveners or for members of communities? We have found the landscape to work for both. It works. It really helps conveners get a sense of why is it so difficult to do what I'm doing? Why are those hills and those valleys so difficult to cross? Because inside of a valley, the gradient of learning is not very well defined, so it's very difficult to be in the valley, but it can also be very creative, because also anything can happen in the valley because the gradient is not very well defined. It's been really useful to talk about members of community and say, listen, your hill is great, but it's only one hill in a much broader landscape. You cannot just focus on your hill because you are just too local. So for us, it's been a language that has helped us really work both with theorists and with practitioners and with members, with people who are actually living in the landscape. Also, the notion of trajectory through the landscape. It's been also very useful. for us to talk about learning as a journey through the landscape, and to talk about the difficulty in crossing from one hill to another. You know, that actually if you move from one hill to another, what you knew before all of a sudden doesn't work because it's a different hill. And so it's not that you're stupid, it's just that you have crossed the valley, and so to start thinking about the difficulty that people experience as they journey through a landscape in terms of the texture of the landscape has been a useful way of talking. So for us, it's very pragmatic. You know, when a term seems to do a lot of good work, good conceptual work for us, we adopt that term.
And Lucy says, do systems conveners hop from one landscape to another, or do they stick to one? Actually, there was John Hegarty, who was one of the people that we interviewed for the systems convening paper, and he was saying, he made the observation that when you've got this passion and this drive inside you, you know, which organization you do it for doesn't matter. An organization is just a vehicle for your systems convening instinct. And so I would say that, I mean, it's a lot of work to be a systems convener, a hell of a lot of work. So you wouldn't like dilettante, it wouldn't be like belonging to multiple different communities, because it's like a full-time obsession. So, you know, just one landscape is a full-time obsession. But if in the work that you're doing, if in your organization, for example, you're not able to do it, if you moved to another organization, you might sort of have a slightly different landscape, but you would still be looking, you'd be looking at it as a landscape and thinking how you could reconfigure it. So you might move between different landscapes, but it would be very hard to be like, you wouldn't say, it's not so easy to say multi-membership by systems conveners, or not multi-membership, multi-systems convening across landscapes. That would be, I think, probably too hard.
And it's interesting because Darren was asking, so is the landscape just a person's view, or is it something that has some external reality? Well, I think the trajectory through the landscape gives you a certain perspective on the landscape, and that is very, very important because we, as Bev was saying, we've seen an important characteristic of systems convener is often that they have traveled to the landscape. So it gives you a certain perspective. But we would also say that the hills are objective. You know, the hills are real, and if you try to fake it, you know, and say, oh, I belong to this hill, but in fact you don't have the competence, people are gonna reject you. So the fact that certain communities have grabbed ownership of the hill and of the definition of who belongs there is not just a personal perspective, because, you know, if you try to join a community and you don't have the competence, I think you're going to find a lot of resistance. This is not just your own perspective. So we would say that the landscape is fairly external to the person, although our ability to reshape the landscape should not be under-evaluated. Now, where a landscape ends and another begins is also less well-defined than for a hill. So, you know, and in one way you could see the whole planet as one landscape, but it's often useful to focus on the education landscape, the legal landscape,
But also, as Darren said, asked earlier, but that question's disappeared now, is that it is subjective as to what the landscape looks like. What the landscape looks like. In fact, when we map the landscape with our clients in the beginning, we get them to map the landscape, but then to invite other people, other stakeholders in to see how they see the landscape. And so the landscape becomes a possibility for negotiating a shared understanding of what that landscape looks like.
Yes, because the landscape can look very differently, can look very different from different hills, you know, and from depending on how you are on the hill and so on and so forth. So.
And somebody asked, I think Linda asked something about if we're moving away from building communities, And what we're actually doing, what the language is doing here is actually expanding. So if you look at a landscape of practice, within that landscape, you'll see communities of practice, you'll see networks, you'll see projects, you'll see conversations. There's a whole bunch of different things going inside a landscape. And what we would say is, after looking at the landscape, you might see a space in there for some kind of intervention, an intervention of what we would say is a social learning space. Now that social learning space might be a community of practice, it might be a network, it might be that you need a boundary encounter, it might be that, you know, what that space looks like in order to tinker with the landscape is then, you know, up for discussion. So building community is still there, but it's one of a number of social learning spaces that are appropriate at different places in the landscape.
So Jenny, we are not saying that everybody should be a systems convener. Actually, I think we think it's very difficult work. We think it's parallel. We have seen many systems conveners go through dark nights of calling this landscape is just impossible to move. It's very difficult work. We think that there is still very good reason to have specialists. So we don't think that the ideal landscape is more flat. You know, I think especially because the world is becoming more complex, to have people who are still upholding very steep hills is very important work. So no, we are not saying that everybody should become a systems convener, but we are saying that it is an important role as we move into the 21st century and as learning becomes a process of involved, not become, as learning involves a process of reconfiguring the landscape, we're going to have to recognize the role of systems conveners. We're going to have to know what it takes to do that, to know how to support it, and for organizations to see that it's a role that often doesn't fit very neatly within the structures that they have established. So we think that there is a language there that needs to be developed for organizations to recognize, but not to say that everybody needs to do that.
And Romy asks if the systems convener is the scout, the knower of the landscape and the people there. Well, those are the important things for the systems convener, but it's more than that. It's actually shifting how things already happen, shifting the types of conversations, creating new alliances, new spaces for new alliances. And relating it to Jenny's question about community experts, I'm not quite sure, Jenny, what you mean by community experts, but actually often the systems conveners that we've worked with may not be necessarily very good at facilitating, for example, or of being an expert in the community. Often they don't actually get into that level of detail. So they need to be able to engage people in new conversations, and if they themselves can't do it, which they often can't, they need to maybe employ or work with a community expert who will be able to do that, or work with a facilitator who will be able to really get down to the nitty-gritty of designing and engaging people in new spaces and new conversations.
Well, like Linda noticed that the metaphor is very geographical and not so interactional. That is really a good point. We are not abandoning. We still think we still think of our theory as a social learning theory. So it is still very much social. Although the geographical aspect, I think, is important. This notion that what we're talking is a kind of geography of competence that has time and space dimensions. I think it's still very important. For instance, you know, the whole notion of scale is problematized by the notion of a landscape because the texture is complex, and so scale is always difficult when you think of people living in separate hills. I wanted to also pick up on Gabriel's thing about emotional work. I can tell you, I work with systems convener as a lot of emotional dimension. It's people, it involves people's whole being, and yes, working across multiple practices is often difficult, because people think, what are you talking about? You don't understand anything about our health. Why should we listen to you? Organizations don't recognize what you're doing. But still, the people who do it always seem to be people who are personally engaged in what they're doing. They are not just emotionally aloof. And one of the reasons they can do the work they do is also because they are engaged in it. Yeah, so geography changes and has resistance. So, yeah.
So we're coming to the end of the top of the hour, and Bev and Etienne, I'm wondering if you want to offer some challenge questions back that might guide our reflections as we prepare to delve into the cases that we're going to be looking at tomorrow and the next day.
Well, I think for us, if it was at all possible, we would love to hear people's own stories and own experience with a perspective like this. Is it possible for people to actually talk as well as us?
Yes, we can do that, and we will probably do that tomorrow as well. With this size group, I think we decided that chat was the easiest to manage.
Okay. Yes, because what the next two sessions, the one from IDA and Habit Forum, those are two good examples of systems conveners or systems convening in completely different contexts in different parts of the world. So there we've worked with IDA and Habit Forum and know Mark and Marielle and Patrice well and Joanne, and so they're going to tell their stories using some of the language from here. But if it was possible to have, an example from somebody who's here.
Actually, we had planned for you to tell the story of a boundary encounter in the sarcophagus project. I think that would be also, because of course one way to deal with the landscape is to bring different practices in contact with each other, not necessarily to create a new practice that would often be too costly and too disruptive, but to increase the knowledgeability of both sides through direct encounter with each other.
So in fact, we have a discussion going in CP Square that has 2 or 3 examples that have been offered, although not fully developed in terms of the language that you're offering. So I think that is a piece of work to start really unpacking the story and what all it can imply and how to describe it more fully in more depth.
John, is the call 1 hour or 90 minutes?
We planned on.
Did you tell people? All right.
Well, goodness, I thought we were talking about 1 hour, but
Okay.
I'm available. If you are ready to, if you're willing to continue, and there's interest, then let's continue. Definitely.
Well,
Okay.
I can give an example
90
there.
minutes.
Carry on.
90 minutes.
Okay. So I can give an example here of it's actually a community of practice. It's actually a landscape really of practices, or it's much more helpful to think of it as a landscape of practices. In this case, the convener, the systems convener here is somebody from the World Bank in their parliamentary strengthening program. And what you have in there already exist in Southern Africa and in Eastern Africa, particularly Southern Africa, different countries in Southern Africa, their public accounts committees, who are members of parliament who are concerned with fishing out corruption and making sure that the government spends their money wisely. Those public accounts committees meet as networks to get better at what they're doing. They have a challenging task, and actually being able to talk to each other across different countries about what to do and how to do and their very specific problems, they find very helpful. This is after years of the bank, sending in experts to tell public accounts committees what they should do and expecting them to go and apply it, and that system didn't really work. So the bank has been very positive about supporting these networks of public accounts committees to come together and work out how to do it better. So that would be a sort of straightforward community of practice in a way, except it's rather complicated because it's across different countries. And in fact, because there's also a network in Eastern Africa, they brought together the countries, the network of Eastern Africa and the network of Southern Africa together in one community of practice. But of course, public accounts committees, the sort of general scope of what they do is, the first thing that happens is the national audit institutions, they're the ones who audit government accounts and publish those audit reports, and they give them to the public accounts committee to then analyze them and choose which ones they should follow up on. And then they do a public hearing. They carry out a public hearing where they're allowed to bring in anybody. In some countries they can they have the power to call in the president. They have different powers in different countries. But they hold a public hearing, and then they hold a public hearing and they decide who and what is guilty, how things should be changed, and they make recommendations to Parliament. Parliament then puts those into, follows up on those recommendations, or they don't. And so actually the Public Accounts Committee, the work of the Public Accounts Committee is very tied in with their relationship with the national audit institutions. So there the banks start, when you start looking at this as a landscape, you then start having to build in, so that the Public Accounts Committees are usually, have been traditionally very suspicious of the audit institutions who come up with huge fat 300-page reports written in gobbledygook language, which are very hard for them to read or understand, and they're members of Parliament they're not interested in reading. So they have a relationship to work out with the national audit institutions who say, yes, but we've got to be very technical, we've got to be very accurate, otherwise we're not doing our job properly. So seeing this as a landscape becomes helpful because you start saying, okay, how can we build in some good encounters, good conversations between the Public Accounts Committee and the audit institutions. Then if you go downstream, the Public Accounts Committee, they make their recommendations to Parliament. And actually, even if the Public Accounts Committee has done a brilliant job, if Parliament doesn't follow up on their recommendations, then absolutely nothing happens, like is the case in Uganda recently, where the Public Accounts Committee brought in the President and the President's wife. They were found guilty, and everybody's been too embarrassed to do anything about it. So what they need there is they need good relationships with the media, and they need good relationships with the civil society organizations. But actually, Public Accounts Committees tend to see the media as their enemy, because the media don't, they say that the media don't report properly on what's happening. The media will come along and just get a quote from any old person, and not an accurate quote, and then they blow things up in ways that are not helpful for the work of the Public Accounts Committee. So there's a very tense relationship between the media and the Public Accounts Committee, and yet Parliament will only follow up on recommendations if they're politically motivated to do so. And they're politically motivated if the media take it up, and also the same with civil society organizations, if civil society organizations are powerful. So what you see here was a boundary encounter that we organized between the Public Accounts Committee and the media. So,
which was actually organized opportunistically, right? Because there was a conference.
That's right.
It was not even planned, right?
It wasn't planned, no. They were having a conference. The Public Accounts Committees were having their network, their annual meeting in a hotel in Juba in South Sudan. And actually, as it happened at the same time, there was another African conference for media people happening in the hotel, in the same hotel, and they were renting some of the hotel rooms for their conference too. It was actually organized by the World Bank, but they don't necessarily speak to each other. But anyway, so what we decided, we actually we had one day where we did a role play of Public Accounts Committees. So the Public Accounts Committee is a very elaborate role play. They did a role play of a public hearing. So what you see in the big square picture in the center, those were in the middle is actually a very inexperienced person in the Public Accounts Committee. She's from South Sudan, but she was made the sort of lead prosecutor of the Public Accounts Committee, the chairperson, and they are doing a public hearing with, in the bottom right-hand corner, those people sitting at that table are people from different government ministries. They're role-playing. These are also members of Parliament who are being brought in and held to account about some expenditure supposedly on schools, but the money, the schools aren't there. So there was a whole thing going on there. And the media, so there was a role play going on, and actually the more experienced Public Accounts Committees were coaching the less experienced from South Sudan and Ethiopia as to how to conduct a public hearing. But at the same time, the media came in and they followed the public hearing and acted like the media. And so we had this whole day of the public hearing, and then the media went off and they wrote their stories up. They wrote up a story about this public hearing. And then we brought everybody together with the different stories and looked at the types of stories that the media had written and looked at why the media had interpreted this public accounts hearing in the ways that they did, and looked at how they could have done it more accurately. Because in this public hearing, for example, the clerks the clerk of the Public Accounts Committee, if the clerk of the Public Accounts Committee had simply come out and said to the media, this is how it is, these are the main facts, or if they'd sent them a briefing document, they'd have had more accurate information. And nobody's actually thought of that. So there was a whole, an enormous amount of learning that went around through this encounter, and a lot of hot feelings too, because even though it was only a role play, the Public Accounts Committee were furious at some of the stories that the media had come up with. And the media were, where you could see them there with their cameras. The media was sort of like getting in the way. So there was a, you know, there was a real tension between the Public Accounts Committees and the media.
But I think there are a number of things about this story that need to be highlighted. First, as a systems convener, paying attention to opportunities, right? So there was a systems convener working with Bev there, and they saw, oh, here are two practices that really don't understand each other. There's a lot of mistrust between those two practices. They happen to be in the same order. So it's like changing the whole meeting agenda to take advantage of a potential boundary encounter in around a problematic boundary in the landscape. So it's just like noticing that, knowing how to take advantage of that. First thing. Second thing, organizing an activity, designing a learning activity that would actually allow those two practices to bump into each other productively. It takes an art to know, okay, what could that be? Should we read a paper together? Should we, okay, they decided on a role play. I think it's a very, very nice thing because it makes things very real, but at the same time, it allows you to reflect on it in a kind of peaceful, how should I say, yeah, it's not a real thing where people are just like so tense about the real thing that they cannot reflect on the effect of one practice on the other. So I think we should really appreciate, you know, from the point of view of the art of systems convening, how well this was done in some sense to try to do something somewhat transformative. And I don't know how transformative it was in the end, but I think.
Well, the transformation, the problem, it was never woven back into the whole thing. But in terms of the learning and the evaluation of the whole network, there are so many stories that come out of here of how people changed their practice. It was very powerful for everybody involved.
But anyway, we thought we would share that story as an example of an intervention within the landscape. There was a simple encounter. It was not developing a new community at the boundary between those two. That was not the point. But really kind of like increasing the knowledgeability of each, increasing the knowledgeability in the landscape that allows practices to interface more productively. So someone was asking earlier whether knowledgeability is a condition for a convener. Yes, it's definitely a condition for a convener to have enough knowledgeability to know where there are good opportunities for learning intervention. It's also something that conveners have to foster, because in some sense that activity was a way to foster the knowledgeability among those two practices of each other without making them competent. Nobody wanted the media to become members of parliament or the members of parliament to become journalists. That was not the point, or to create a new practice at the boundary. The point was to allow members of different practices to locate what they were doing within the broader landscape, to have a new orientation to what they were doing that took the landscape into account.
And to see that the learning is taking place by new types of conversation in the landscape. So it was the learning was in the landscape, not just in the individual network activities. Mm-hmm.
why not, John? I don't know. Opportunism, it's like, oh, here's a place where we can build a little bridge. Or I think that once you have a landscape perspective, your knowledgeability can make you see moments where, whoa, here is a chance to do a little intervention that's going to change the landscape a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, just John, in the theory, when we talk about the development of knowledgeability, we talk about different modes of identification within the landscape. Actually, there was a slide about that. So, we talk about different modes. So when we were talking about entering a community of practice, we were mostly talking about learning through engagement with the practice of the community. When we are talking about the landscape, we have to talk about a more rich set of modes of identification and relating to a landscape. And so engagement is still a very important mode of developing knowledgeability. So I think that boundary encounter was really using direct engagement in a simulated moment of practice to increase knowledgeability on both sides. But imagination is another important way to relate to a practice. Maybe it's just like see a movie. You can see a movie or a TV show about life in a tenement in Baltimore. Gives you some insight into that practice. It's much less well defined than becoming a member, but it does give you some insight if the TV show is well done into that practice. So you have to use your imagination to sort of get to understand what it's like to be in that practice. And alignment is another mode of identification that's important. How to align your practice so that it contributes to a system of different practices contributing. Yes, and those were introduced in the 98 book. But as we're talking about landscape, as the notion of landscape is taking salience now, these also are becoming more salient as work of systems conveners. And perhaps actually also work of, somebody was asking about higher ed, work of higher ed, that you have to give people a complement of these three modes of identification and in educational context. I don't know if it helps John Magnus, about your question about developing knowledgeability, but we would say, yeah, engage, that is travel, enter in direct interaction engagement with different practices, some of which you will be competent in and some of which you will not. But so that's one mode of developing knowledgeability. Imagination, reading a book, hearing a story, seeing a TV show, all these ways that we develop a picture to orient ourselves in the landscape. And then also alignment, seeing how your practice kind of affects others in terms of aligning around goals, effectiveness, and so on and so forth. So those would be ways that we talk about ways to increase knowledgeability.
So Darren is proposing that Jenny tell something.
Yeah, asking questions. Yes, seeing yourself in that landscape, and so your questions can become oriented towards towards both your trajectory and the places that you would call your home practice or something like this, if there is such a thing. So a question that direct, because it's very difficult to be reflective if you're just on a hill. Okay, so traveling and engaging with other practices, it's beyond just asking questions. It's also kind of letting your existence within the landscape affect you, affect who you are, the sense of how you exist. You know, it's not just an intellectual thing. It's really letting the whole landscape become constitutive of how you experience yourself. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me that's important. It's about your identity, not just an intellectual thing.
Yeah, I don't know about the modelling, John. There is something that a convener has to do to help people understand the implications of different people in the landscape and a sort of worldview or the perspectives at different levels of scale. So there is something important there. I would just say that in my experience with systems conveners, often they're not actually, funnily enough, brilliant communicators, okay, or brilliant models to see, because a lot of it is inside them. Certainly the ones that we looked at.
They do model this orientation to the landscape, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that is really important. And I would say in the example we will see tomorrow and day after tomorrow, you will see people who are living that orientation towards the landscape, and by living it themselves, they are kind of like inviting people into a new way of seeing how they belong.
In fact, IDA have probably taken that. I mean, they've really been very pure about that. Every single thing that they do, you'll hear tomorrow, is really modelling the orientation to the landscape and taking a sort of systems convening approach. Yeah.
Because in some sense, modeling living in the landscape means you never privilege your own position. You never privilege your own hill. You respect your own hill. You ask for respect for the coherence and value of your own hill, but you always see it in relationship to the broader landscape in which it exists. So yeah, I think in that sense, modeling is actually fundamental, and in terms of modeling an identity of walking the landscape.
But IDA are slightly different in the sense that they take it they intentionally model.
That's right, yeah.
But most conveners that I know don't intentionally model, they just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a skill. Modeling is a skill, but it's also a way to be in the world, you know. And that's why I think that was a little ambivalent about it, because it's both a skill that you imply intentionally, but it's also just a way to be. Yeah, very much related to identity. Actually, we call in a more recent version of the theory, we call engagement, imagination, and alignment modes of identification. You know, modes of letting locations in the landscape become constitutive of who you are. You know, so if you know if you're a scientist and sort of aligning with certain methods of analyzing data becomes really an important part of your identity. You know, or if you have a religious affiliation, adopting certain moral standards becomes aligning with those standards becomes an important part of who you are. It becomes definitional of your engagement with the world. So for us, identity is a very, very important part of the learning theory in relation to one's journey across that landscape and the kind of relationships to different locations that become significant over time. No, identification is not the same as identity. Identity is the work of becoming a person through learning in our theory. So identity has a technical definition. It's the work of being a person through learning in different places across the landscape, across time and across space. Whereas identification is a process of letting a location in the landscape become constitutive of who you are. So identification is an important part of how identity is formed, but identification is a relationship. It's the management of a relationship between you and a place in the landscape. So identification can be negative. It can be disidentification. So if there are certain practices that you reject, you know, so that we disidentification. No, I don't know what you'd have to think that, but I would say that the systems conveners that we have seen are very embedded in the field of practice, you know, and are very actually. I would say that the fact that Women's Flow was able to convene that very complex community, which is I don't think we conveyed enough in that story the difficulty that exists in convening a community of the type of transparency and accountability that Bev was describing. Because those boundaries are very, very difficult to renegotiate. And there's a lot of mistrust, there are a lot of political issues. So the person who was doing that was really, she was very, very embedded in that landscape. She had good competence in certain practices, but also a lot of relationships, a lot of network and involvement in different conversations. So that embeddedness, the fact that she was embedded in the practice and recognized by others as embedded in that field, recognized by others as someone who was struggling with forming an identity with respect to the landscape. That was really essential. Okay, yeah. It's
So
great.
thanks,
I think in wrapping up, first let us thank you for, those were really interesting questions and insights that you brought up. So,
Yes, thank you, everybody. Really, really interesting.
really pushing our thinking.
Yeah. And see you tomorrow.
So, yes, we'll be continuing the conversation online, probably not as active or as rich as this, but we'll get together again tomorrow at the same time, the same station. So thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Yep. Thank you
Bye.
for organizing. That was great. Yep.
Bye.